Greetings, Mr. and Mrs. Middle America and all the ships at sea. In for George Norrie, this is Ian Punnett, and to the hostile, invading alien armies hovering silently just out of Earth's atmosphere, or maybe beneath it. Remember, eat the Canadians first. So, been a big week of news. Lots going on. And yet the story that keeps tripping me out is the story about the starfish. Did you see that? Get back to that in a second. Tonight we have a guest. I think this will be fun. You know, I have to say it's been a minute since I've done a show about underground bases or caves with reptilians, or any of the other research that's been done by our guest tonight, John Rhodes. I look forward to talking to him. I tell you up front because it's important. I always believe in transparency. That's like a bridge too far for me. I mean, I really enjoy the shows, and I hope you'll enjoy this one. I know I will. But I can't quite get my mind around the science, if you will, of it. Like, what are the physics of it? I just watched this great series on, I think it was on Netflix, hosted by Morgan Freeman, about the creation of the planet. And there were lots of things in there that make me go, what? You know, I mean, it's not that we know everything or that we're not still learning new things about our environment. But this is one I think we would know. So we'll get back to that coming up in just a moment. Also coming up tomorrow night on Coast to Coast, we'll talk about holy food. This is a great book about the sacramental use of food, about the importance of food in religion and in the way in which we conduct our lives. And it may become increasingly more important again if the climate keeps changing. I don't know if you saw that story, but there's another year of El Nino on the way. And this El Nino weather pattern really does affect the way crops can be grown in spring, how late harvest goes or doesn't. I mean, so if food becomes more scarce, or we reach a kind of, you know, if we're eating like blue cubes coming up or something, it is going to change our society. There is this age-old connection between the scarcity of food and how it's formed us as people, and we'll do that as the main guest coming up tomorrow night on Coast to Coast. And then our friend John Pelton Young, who is it John? God, you know, I'm so sorry. I just, for a moment, it's Robert, and I kind of like blanked out for a second. It's Robert Young Pelton. I do that all the time with him. In fact, I have to look up his name like 3 times because I keep flipping the names around. He's one of my favorite guests, too, which is funny. But he's going to talk about the world a little bit. He's traveled by foot. He's met with the mullahs. He's met with these tribes. He's met with a lot of the different people that are in the news today. And we'll talk about that tomorrow night with, let me try it again, Robert Young Pelton. But first, let's get to the subject which pushes us all about reptilians. And let me say before I do, back to the starfish thing, which I put a pin in. I don't know if you saw this story. CNN was reporting a new scientific breakthrough that finally explains how starfish are constructed. I mean, it falls under, you know, sort of these interesting topologies, and, you know, we've learned a lot about starfish over the years, and we kind of romanticize it because it's in the shape of a star, and we have stars on the beach and stars in the sky and all of that. But the real story that scientists believe they have determined once and for all, I find it's like one of the trippiest things I've read about in a long time, which is sort of a perfect introduction into our topic next. And then we'll do open lines on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, let me wrap up that CNN story so that we can go into our main guest before we do open lines on Coast to Coast, because I think the two are kind of interrelated. And I say that because I believe we're always learning new things. And there are things that have been with us for millennia that we thought we understood but don't. One of those has been starfish, right? So starfish had been considered, I remember I learned about them in like high school or something. And then when I was scuba diving for a while, we used to encounter them all the time, big and small, that starfish supposedly had this layer of tube feet beneath them that could help move the marine creature along the seafloor, and then essentially feed that five slit kind of gullet that it used to collect and pass up food. And then these five identical arms were somehow connected to kind of a central brain. So now genetic research suggests the exact opposite, that sea stars are largely bodiless heads. They lack torsos or tails. And that they are just kind of like a head that has learned how to walk. Oh, man. That's like right out of sci-fi stuff. So I passed that along to you. You can Google it. You can find out more. It was in CNN's Wonder Theory Science newsletter. But again, that brings me back to, well, what else don't we know? John Rhodes is a researcher. He is known affectionately as the crypto hunter, and he joins us now on Coast to Coast. Hi, John.
Hi, Ian. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. I loved reading through your website, and I can tell, there's like a line where it's like, okay, that's really interesting, dotted line, and then big black line I can't seem to get over. So I look forward to having this conversation with you tonight, and thank you for your patience in advance.
No problem at all. I look forward to talking with you and listening to questions from the audience, of course.
Good. Because your basic FAQ page is good. The website, reptoids.com, can be linked up to it, coasttocoastam.com. And you can contact him there, and you can see what he reads, and you can find out a lot more about his research. But let's just start at the beginning. Okay, so I imagine there has to be some sort of lineage, some sort of origin story, something that you link that brings us back to how is it that reptile-like alien creatures are here with us, coexisting, but mostly underground?
Well, that's the key question. It looks like, our Earth produces some quite fantastic creatures over time, like you were just mentioning with the starfish, the bodiless brain walking around on two legs.
It's so freaky. It's just so weird. It's like there's that Ray Milland movie I keep thinking about, right, or whatever.
Yeah, with Rosie Greer.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so you think? Yeah, we're learning about that, right? So what can you verify?
The real backbone to when I started getting seriously involved in this is of course listening to the patterns of individuals and their abductions or their sightings back in the very early 1990s. I kind of listened to what they had to say, and I heard that it was different than what everybody else was talking about. And I went on the Internet, what was the Internet at that time, and there was absolutely zero mention of reptilians on the Internet. It was quite remarkable. And I was thinking, well, why hasn't anybody at least talked about this? And what I found is that these cases, when you started pursuing the science behind it and the potential for these creatures being here, these beings, I should respectfully say, that there was a paleontologist by the name of Dale Russell. And Dale Russell was approached by NASA and asked about what would aliens look like on a different planet. And what he did with his associate up in the Museum of Canada up in Ottawa, the Museum of Nature up in Ottawa, they produced a model of what the dinosaur called Troodon, which was walking upright on two legs, and he had a nice grasping thumb. It was kind of unusual. And his brain was starting to get larger than the other dinosaurs. He was walking up on two legs. His eyes were coming from this. Over time, they could tell the eyes were moving more towards each other, allowing stereo vision, which allows you to have better depth perception. And what he did is he produced this model and presented it to NASA, and it was basically of a humanoid reptile. And he said, given the morphological changes over time that we can see, if the dinosaurs had not been wiped out, almost, because birds survived, or dinosaurs that became the birds,
right.
What would these creatures look like? And the model was this very striking image. And I looked at it, and I couldn't believe it. I actually called him up, and I said, Mr. Russell, I said, it's hard to believe that these things could be the way they are, and I'm interested in researching this. And he was very open and talked about the difficulties he encountered from his fellow colleagues. And he said to me towards the end of the conversation that really the pursuit of this question would not be professionally economical, which means that you're going to be finding it hard as a
you're going to be hounded.
Yes, you're going to be finding it hard to pay your bills as a scientist if you start pursuing this line of thought. And not only were NASA involved, also over in Los Alamos in the 1980s, they had a fellow coexisting meeting to discuss extraterrestrials, which included Frank Drake. And they actually addressed the whole issue of Dale Russell's dinosauroid. They called it the dinosauroid. And they said this could potentially be something that we're looking at on another planet. But then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, some of the most ancient records here on Earth talk about reptiles that had a humanoid form or at least could talk. And, I mean, biblically, they received these stories from ancient times, to say what kind of truth is in this little nugget here.
Right.
Because remember, the original religious text that the Jews had, they actually talk about the serpent in the Garden of Eden as having two legs of a man and two arms of a man that could actually run through the garden after Adam, threateningly.
Right.
And they say he was as tall as a camel. So when I started hearing these scientific reports projecting what would have happened, and then we know the birds survived, and they flourished, and they diversified considerably over time, and they don't look like dinosaurs like we would think dinosaurs would look like. Then it started occurring to me, but maybe we're getting something where we have a remote group of these creatures who may have also survived underground in an environment that reptiles are quite used to, and could they have evolved over time parallel to mankind on the surface? And this seemed to fit a lot of the mythologies that we had, ranging from Near Eastern to Middle Eastern to Asian and also to Western mythologies or religions and the books that talked about the ancient times. And that's really kind of what pushed me further and further into the question.
Well, so there's a difference, as you know, between the age of reptiles and the age of dinosaurs, right? Hundreds of millions of years between those two things. Largely, reptiles got wiped out after the age of reptiles, except for those that had gone underground. And the same thing's true in the age of dinosaurs. There were more than just birds, but not many, species that burrowed and had found a way to survive the end of the age of dinosaurs, where they reemerged and then began the, all of the branches from there came from those creatures. Some of those include crocodiles and alligators and other things that we know of, but there's a handful of other species. So that is an interesting theory that underground, things survived. But tell me about this concept, though, that a reptile with a developing brain and is it bicameral vision would be able to walk on two legs. Is there any evidence that particular dinosaur ever lived underground?
The Troodon was already walking on two legs. A lot of people don't realize most of the dinosaurs were going into bipedalism.
Right. Well, a lot of them were right, and especially even the ones that walked on all fours still fed by leaning backward and depending on their back legs. But let's not miss the question: is there any evidence that says the Troodon at any time was living under the ground?
No, there isn't any evidence of that.
Okay.
But we've got to remember that most reptiles do seek cover under some sort of shelter. They're not just sleeping out in the open all the time. And they're ectothermic, so they've got to preserve their body temperatures.
Yeah, no, I totally get that.
If they're underground, we've just barely skimmed the surface of our planet. We haven't even walked on every meter of our planet. So there's an entire underworld under our feet that's unexplored. 1/2000th of the Earth's surface actually has entrances into caverns and caves.
Yeah.
And most people don't go into those caverns and caves. And ever since the 1988 Federal Cave Resources Act went into effect, that basically made it forbidden for people to go walking into caves without a federal cave expert.
Sure.
And they say if you do, you can go to jail.
No, interesting. But to the degree that it is germane to the actual creature. So, and this is my skepticism showing, but if it's so, there are evolutionary motives, right? There are forces that impact species, and I'm trying to figure out what in this concept of reptiles going underground and continuing to pursue bipedalism and that they had, as you said, sort of rudimentary opposing thumbs, and that they had a developing brain. Why were they morphing? What was being exerted on them that they would continue to morph as though they were living on the surface?
I think that we're talking about a convergence, an evolutionary convergence, which means that the environment itself has pressures on the physical form that tend to push things in different ways.
Right. Lack of oxygen, lack of food. That sort of thing.
And there's a paleontologist by the name of Simon Conway over in England, and he believes that reptiles and humans could have also achieved a convergent evolution over time. And so we've got other scientists that look at these body forms and they go, well, morphological changes happen over time. Sometimes, according to the teachings of evolution, we get these periods called punctuated equilibriums,
sure,
which is a scientific term meaning that evolution, some process happens on the planet to where things can change shape rather quickly. The sea anemone is one. That used to be like these spiny little creatures. They are the spiny little creatures you don't dare step on. I've stepped on quite a few and pulled those thorns out, those spikes. But a long time ago, they were rather flowery, beautiful creatures. And then it seems like overnight, all around the planet, they changed, not just in one area, but all around the planet. And so these periods are very fast. It's not slow change over long periods of time, but very fast changes. And we're all under these pressures in our environments, and even humans, if you could speed it up, I'm sure have made the same type of changes in body size. I mean, you go to London, and some of some of these older villages over in Europe, and you notice the houses are some of them are rather small, and the front doors are rather small, and you're like, why is everything so small? It's because a long time ago, we didn't have 6-foot average heights or 5-foot.
Right.
And it just wasn't that way.
Yeah. And, of course, the British are notoriously poor basketball players. You're talking about the Stephen Jay Gould theory of punctuated equilibrium. I know a little bit about that. But that brings me back to, though, how sophisticated a vision you have for these reptilians. And, as you mentioned, the many entrances and exits that might exist. We'll find out more. John Rhodes is great. We're having a great time. It's a fun Friday night on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Sorry, I had my mic off. Talking with John Rhodes on Coast to Coast AM. Then we'll do open lines coming up tomorrow night. I'll tell you more about it later because I want to get right back to this. So we would agree that there are evolutionary needs, right? Which then it changes the pigment of our human skin. Those people living closer to the equator. We see blind fish in the deepest ocean develop lights on top of their head to attract prey, which then they're able to sense and then eat. It would make no sense for a crocodile or an alligator to develop a light on the top of its head if it didn't produce more food or attract a mate or whatever. So part of me struggles with this concept of how was it then that these reptoids developed and or continued to flourish under the ground to the point where, as you suggest, they have evolved. So let's put that aside for now. That having been said, explain what you think the qualitative research that you've done, all of the interviews, the collection of stories, what does it indicate to you about what's going on underneath our feet?
Well, it's twofold, I believe, or almost threefold. First of all, we have our own military-industrial complex dug in around the planet, and we're talking about thousands of underground bases, not just a few, I'm talking thousands. And it's not only here in the United States, in some of the other developed countries, and perhaps even undeveloped countries, they have them. So we use that because our military has learned a long time ago the best place to hang out is underground. In World War I and a lot in World War II, a lot of the war was fought in underground tunnels and underground bases that the Nazis had. That's one of the things about World War II we don't see very often in the movies. I've got, reports of some of these underground bases are quite large.
Right. I agree.
For example, I'm going to just give you a quick one here. A lot of people don't realize. In a newspaper report of 1946 in the St. Louis Star and Times, they said that a gentleman by the name of Zantaro Tanaka, he was 26, a Japanese corporal. He was caught in Korea by the Soviets in 1945. He said, I'll read it here. I was blindfolded and put on a train. We rode all night. The next day we were unloaded in Iman, and that's the name of the town. The name of the town has actually changed since then. We were hauled into trucks and pointed outside the city, given shovels and put to work. 50,000 prisoners were scooping the earth from a gigantic plane there to make an underground airport. There were 80, radiating runways, each 1,000 meters or 3,280 feet in length. And they said about one-third of the prisoners died building it. And this was on the Soviet-China border.
Right.
So that gives you an idea in 1945 of the kind of places they were building. Now we're talking about a hub-shaped circular airport or military installation that has runways faced in all directions, 80 of them. So they can just fire out aircraft like unbelievable, like the Thunderbirds in the old TV show.
Thunderbirds are go.
Yeah, Thunderbirds go. So when you hear of that, and then you put it together with the fact that ever since then, I've read newspaper reports talking about large dirigibles in World War II being stored underground in large underground hangars. I haven't heard of any of those ever being discovered or talked about. So we have all kinds of strange things going on underground by our own military. On top of that, we have perhaps extraterrestrials who are visiting the planet, and I just can't seem to reason why they would come such great distances only to hang out for a day or two and then head back home. At least we knew when we were watching Star Trek, those guys would set up some sort of monitoring base where they couldn't be seen so they could watch the inhabitants of the planet and study them. And I believe to some great extent that's also happening.
Okay.
How long some of these extraterrestrials have been here, I don't know. They may have had generations of them born on the planet that think that this is also their home planet because this is where they were born. So that could be happening.
Okay, but let's pause that. So the idea of the U.S. military or any military around the world building underground bases makes sense, right? I mean, especially because of aerial bombing.
Correct.
In World War II, you went underground. Not the Pentagon does not list every installation, and many of them are very intricate, to the degree that they could support, hundreds of thousands of people or a very complex life. I don't know, but they seem very kind of functional. So. They were functional to the point where it could be a plane, it could be a dirigible, it could be a train that came in and out. It could be a lot of things. And and there were people who were POWs. Obviously, a lot of Jews were forced to dig and build and reinforce these underground bunkers for the Nazis themselves to survive or attempt to win the war, even if it was just for testing organizations. But that still doesn't put me closer to the concept of what's your vision then for these reptilians? What are you saying, they take over the vacant bases? I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand, the connection you're making.
I believe that we have our own underground bases, but there are also probably very remote locations in which these craft fly from, also using the underground to shield themselves from being monitored by satellites or anything else. For us to see lights in the sky, we are just automatically assuming that if they outperform our aircraft and people say they're anomalous, that they must come from outside our planet or from another dimension. We have, since the 1930s, been redirected. Back in the old days, literature used to be filled with, what's living underground? What kind of monsters? What kind of lost civilizations? And all of a sudden, the entire subject matter of phenomenon changed, and we were looking off our planet. And I really believe that's kind of a form of a distraction, where they say, look off our planet and think about the subject matter. Meanwhile, what's happening here underground on our own planet?
As I was reading your website, again, we're talking with John Rhodes. You can link up to him at coasttocoastam.com and go take a look at the stories he's collected and the research that he has done on the subject of reptoids, especially those that live in these complicated or sophisticated communities underground. I agree that it's the stuff. I mean, as I was reading, I thought this is the stuff of Jules Verne.
Yeah.
Right. This is the stuff of H.G. Wells, to name two original authors on subjects like this. So
Arthur C. Clarke. Let me just jump in real quick. Arthur C. Clarke, when he wrote his book Childhood's End, he refers to the alien that came down to Earth as looking like the devil, and our classical descriptions of the devil are of a reptile talking. And the older descriptions, like I said, are also of them walking.
Well, I get that, but remember that the other part of that Genesis narrative, of which I am very familiar, is that God created all of the creatures in the Garden of Eden, without exception. Mm-hmm. So, there is no discussion of a serpentine-like creature coming down from heaven, entering into the otherwise perfect garden. I'll grant you, he's the only one. That serpent is the only thing that is mentioned as having the ability to talk or to communicate. But that's kind of part of the story, right?
That's just kind of part of the story. We don't, remember these guys that wrote these religious works a long time ago, they were taking information that they were provided and writing it down in some sort of a digestible manner. And when they composed the Bible, they were basically including all of these myths from all around the world and trying to find out the common denominators between all of them so they could invite members of other religions over to the Christian religion because, you have, in Babylon, you have a guy that was swallowed by a fish, but we have that story as well.
Well, that predates Christianity, though. So
that predates.
Right. So, but to make that point, it wasn't all over the world. It was all over the region that God took different names and different forms. And so this, in order to include every group, they're all kind of mashed in there together under the understanding that they're different names for the same thing. And so, the Babylonian exile is a good example. There are other myths about Babylonian exile. There's other myth about a giant fish, a Noah narrative. I mean, there's all sort of a flood, obviously. Right. I mean, all sorts of it. But, okay, so again, tell me the vision of what you think is going on underneath our feet right now.
Well, I think that we have small groups of advanced cultures, human and non-human, living underground. And they feel very well preserved down there. If anything happens like some sort of cosmic disaster where everybody on Earth is destroyed from a comet or something like that hitting the planet, they're going to survive because they're underground. I think that most of them have retreated under there, if not for safety from the environment, from safety from us, because we are one vicious animal species group on the planet.
Yeah, we're the most dangerous anyway. What about...
What I read on Facebook someday,
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Yeah, if we go by social media, we are the most vicious.
Hey, listen, when the aliens drive past Earth, they lock their doors,
That's funny. All right, But if we're talking about the Troodon and then the Troodon's descendants, if it continued to grow underground when the above ground dinosaurs have been wiped out, what would be the reason? How is it that civilization goes on to be so sophisticated as you imagine?
Well, I believe it's more, I wouldn't call it sophisticated because we have sophistication as well, but I think that because of the different brain types, their brains are working completely different than ours.
Right.
And so how we perceive science and what we can learn from it may be two different things. We have common things we could learn, but also things that are pretty distinct to how our brain is functioning and what it allows us to even think.
Okay.
And so when you're talking about sophisticated learning, I've talked to some really, really intelligent people at times, who are really sophisticated. And there's others at times that I've talked to that aren't. And it's not so much that they're all sophisticated. I believe that we have some maybe near surface pocket groups of creatures that also answer to the same physical description, like that was discovered in 1988 down in Bishopville, South Carolina.
Which is a great tab on your website. Do you want to tell the story of Bishopville?
Well, in 1988, a young boy was changing a tire out in the middle of a swamp road, and it was late at night, early morning. And as he was changing the tire, he saw something running through swamp area towards his direction, and he said it was upright and it had glowing red eyes, and it was running fast towards him, and he got scared. He jumped in his car, threw the rest of the tools in the front seat, jumped in the car, and started driving down the road, and something jumped on his roof, and he could actually see a hand reaching down, trying to reach through the window and grab the side mirror. And when he got back home, he was so scared he couldn't talk, and his family, he started going into a fit, and his family was wondering what's wrong. They called the Sheriff Truesdale out, and Sheriff Truesdale's always kind of he's presented as like this local, Southern sheriff, but this gentleman was a good friend of mine. He was trained at the FBI courses over with the FBI, so he's had a lot of training behind him. So he started investigating what was going on around there, and there were multiple eyewitnesses that described something that was like a lizard man. He was about 7.5 feet tall, had large arms. He had very muscular build, and this was reported by several people. And in the end of the entire years and years of going through these different cases where people said their cars were kind of mauled and they think it may have been by the lizard man, some of these may have been hoaxes, but some of them certainly weren't, because when the young boy was brought into the station, he passed lie detector tests twice, about what he had seen.
Right.
And, Mr. Truesdale died just recently, and he said to me, no matter what's going on, he says, it's not normal. And he says, in those swamps in there, nobody can get in, they're so thick. He said, so you could have anything living in those swamps, deep in the swamps, and we wouldn't know it. And this is the same kind of thing where people have gone down to Bishopville and they said, no, this has got to be Bigfoot, because people are fully invested in their research. So they'll try and go into other areas where it's the drawings and everything that's described is talking about a reptilian humanoid, but they come down and say, no, it must have been Bigfoot, because that's what they know.
Right. Yeah. There's confirmation bias. What's the image then that you have in your head that you think is closest to what this guy had in Bishopville?
Oh, you mean as far as in media?
What it looks like. I mean,
okay.
So,
well, I can give you a physical description.
Okay.
We're talking about beings that are on average height. The ones that have been seen have been about anywhere from 6.5 to about 7.5 to 8 foot tall.
Okay.
Large muscular arms and legs. They have scales across their body. The scales on their chest are more broad, like plates. Their head is large. It's got a little bit of a crown on the top, kind of like a gorilla. And they have no hair. Their eyes are almond-shaped. Their pupils have cat-like eyes with vertical slit pupils. Their hands have 3 fingers with an opposing thumb. And their feet seem to have a raised, like a dew claw, or a thumb, I guess, or an atrophied thumb, way up near where we have our ankle bone. And they also have no lips and no ears. So they might have a kind of a crustal type ear, maybe a scale or something over where normal ears are, but the mouth has absolutely no lips at all. It's just a very wide mouth. And this is what was described. And remember, by the way, I'm going to jump back to this thing about Arthur C. Clarke. When he wrote the book Childhood's End.
Well, you're going to have to hang on to that because we're coming up to the top of the hour. So we'll start with Arthur C. I think it's going to be a few minutes before we get to your calls, but at least by the bottom of next hour, we'll open up the lines so you too can talk to John Rhodes, and then we'll do open lines. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett.